Thank you very much for joining us here on the Voice of Job Seekers. This is Marc, and I am your host, of course. You can always catch the past episodes either on iTunes under the Voice of Job Seekers, or you can go to voiceofjobseekers.com and you'll see what the podcasts are. And hopefully you'll join us and continue to join us this week as I'm being interviewed with or by Marc Miller of Career Pivot. And you have remembered, if you've been listening to the show, you remember him being a guest on my show. This time we flipped the script, and let me tell you what this show is about. And, I really feel proud of this particular interview because I think there were some things that I was able to express that I haven't been able to express yet on a podcast. And this is about unconscious bias and how it can work against particularly the seasoned workers or job seekers. And if, their bias is being taken consideration on social media and the things that are being done by older workers that I've seen throughout the years, and maybe you have seen as well, that puts you in an age bracket. And there are things that make it really obvious. Using phrases or continue to use a lot of phrases like, I'm old school. It sounds like you're kicking and screaming to use the new technology, or saying, I don't post very often, but when I do, I'm pretty much old school when it comes to it, doesn't necessarily put you in the light that employers want to see. So I got a chance to talk a little bit about that. I considered that the biases that we all grew up with are kind of bookmarks. And they are bookmarks for our own biases in the way that we view the working world and people in it. This particular interview is about the older workers. And, I think for a lot of us, we've been on both sides of the pendulum. We've been on the side where when we were young, we look at old people as not being as relatable. And now that I'm older, I know that I look at younger people not being as relatable. But I've always seen it, me having to come into the real world, so to speak, to make a living, and that's what the articles I've written and the interviews I've done and things I've commented on, and if you see my Twitter feed, it's not too much me talking about old school. I use the old school maybe to compare to some new school ways that you can relate to employers, but I think that's pretty important. Anyway, I want to get right to the interview. I don't want to waste too much more time. So here's Marc Miller and I talking about unconscious bias. By the way, next week there is no show. And then we'll have 2 shows after that, and then I go on a summer hiatus until the week of September 12th. I don't want you to forget that. That'll be in the show notes there at thevoiceofjobseeker.com. Meantime, thanks very much. We will see you in a couple of weeks after this interview.
I've read your bio to my audience before we got on the call, but could you tell them who the real Marc is?
Sure. I'm a family man, been married 26 years, have 2 men now, family. One just graduated from college and gone into the Air Force. The other one's a sophomore at Western Illinois University. And my wife and I are steadily planning for this adventure in our second half of our marriage to what we want to do, and all the plans, which include doing projects like these and doing studies like unconscious bias and how it relates to job seekers. And otherwise, love music trivia, poetry, all things weightlifting. Used to be a personal trainer. Just enjoying this great journey of life.
Now, Marc, I want to correct you. The male brain doesn't finish developing until 25.
I know, they got a long way to go.
Yeah,
I don't think you really get into it and start to realize things start to make sense until you're 35. So,
well, most women will tell you that men don't finally grow up until their 30s, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
I called my son up when he was 25 and say, congratulations on starting to become an adult.
Yeah, well, yeah, they've got to figure the other part out. That when they come to realization, then that's when it all counts.
So, Mark, you've made a name for yourself talking about unconscious bias, your career, workplace, and everywhere. Can you define for the audience what you mean by unconscious bias?
Sure. The study that has been spearheaded, actually the study's been going on since the 70s, but Dr. Durrell Sue is the one that is the name out there for unconscious bias and all things that are related. To not give a clinical definition of it as much as I can, I tried to think of a way to put it in English, and really it's an unaware, non-premeditated assumption that people make that is verbal or nonverbal, that either maligns or insults or snub people of color, different genders, age groups, religion, physical or mental characteristics, and it's usually pretty insulting and degrading by the assumptions that are made. It makes someone, the person that's being violated, or, makes them feel small or hurt. In the case of age bias specifically, it accentuates because it's based on our association with looks or physical ability, most of them diminishing for our part. And it's, I should say, as a result of unconscious bias, microaggressions are the things or little statements or the little actions that make older people feel less valuable. In other words, if I was telling a 50-year-old man or woman she looks good for their age, not that they just would look good, isn't particularly a comment that should be cherished. It's more of an insult. It's only if it was for your age that you look good. So that would be a sample for microaggression. And, of course, how it makes you feel is not very good, especially if it's said by somebody younger. What's interesting about unconscious bias, as well as far as age, is that to some degree we're all guilty of that, having been younger at one point and maybe even calling an older man pops or calling an older woman with gray hair grandma, which, if that grandma just happens to be a weightlifter in pretty good shape, then why would we call her grandma, and why should she embrace it? So there's many different layers that we could talk about here, but nevertheless, yeah, unconscious bias is something that we all have, and it comes out in different ways.
It's interesting. In my last corporate gig, I tried to hire a gentleman who was my age, and my boss said, well, he just doesn't have the energy.
Yeah, that's
right?
one of the bad assumptions. And it's funny you should mention that. I had a client recently that went in for the interview, and we prepared to the core about it. And one of the questions we prepared in answering, and he said the interview went real well in his estimation up until this very point where he was beginning to ask questions. And one of his last questions says, is there anything that I'm missing that would not get me this job or that you would be concerned about? And the interviewer did said, well, we're concerned that that the pace of this place is pretty fast. And our concern is, can you keep up? And it's one of those things where it's saying, you're too old. So it comes out in many different ways as well, not particularly directly, but inferred.
We all grow up with our own biases. Yes, I grew up in New Jersey in almost an entirely white neighborhood. I had 800 people in my graduating class. We had 3 blacks and 1 Hispanic. And I knew them all, but
yeah.
You end up with these biases, and this is no question that because I've traveled overseas a lot, and you try to eliminate a lot of the preconceived ideas you have, but you always have them.
You do.
You try and eliminate them, but Mark, how does unconscious bias apply to the older worker, which both of us I think, fall into that category?
Yes, we do. I think one of the things that we have to consider is that people assume that our skill set is diminished in our ability to be relevant and is restricted in some kind of way. Whether we apply to jobs and an employer starts to see education before 1996, like on a resume, there's a pause and it conjures concern because of that broad word fit, which is beginning to really annoy me, by the way, when I hear people say that. But it's such a broad stroke, you don't know what it means. But having said that, since ageism is so embedded in our culture in the workplace and the job search, it's hard to detect because you can't say whether it's here or whether it's there. Sure, you can possibly accuse someone, but, a lot of times it's just circumstantial. And the laws don't protect aged workers like they do, let's say, what was in place not that long ago for women, as far as being able to say, hey, these are some things and here's some circumstances that could potentially have a lawsuit that's entertained. It's not, that doesn't exist for age, as far as I know, in the States on a broad, and I could be corrected. But to build on that a little bit further, I don't know if you're familiar with Rich Thompson. He is the Chief Human Resources Officer for DECO Staffing. He told me in a discussion last year that gut instinct is relied on in hiring decisions. Now, honestly, most people hire similarly, with or without bias, and most of us do it with bias. But if merit hiring was implemented in many more companies, then conscious bias would be minimized and not as prominent. I didn't say it's be non-existent. I just said it would be minimized. And just recently in Illinois, there's been a notice to major job boards like Monster, Career Builder, Indeed, etc., sent by our state attorney concerning the presence of ageism on job boards. The problem was that, and one of the things that was stated in the statement that was made, and again, it's not a suit yet, it's just a notice that went from the Attorney General, that the drop-down box that required you to select the year you graduated or you got your first job, the dates only go back to 1980. So the Attorney's Office, the General Attorney's Office, contends that that would exclude anyone over 52. I think there are a couple of other things that could be involved in that kind of bias, like having to put the year of your education, those kind of things. But I think they were going for the low-hanging fruit, honestly, first. But if people want to read, one of the better articles that I've seen was on NPR site a couple of weeks ago that talked about it. But does that answer your question? Is about how we would how unconscious bias would fall into that particular category?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting. We all have our own biases. And like you said, calling someone granny, or I grew up in the generation, anybody over 35 couldn't be trusted. Right. So This has been around for a long time. And the question comes down to is it really any different today than it was, 20 years ago?
Well, here's some examples of what I thought of. As older people, we really can't concentrate on so much of who's going to be against us. It shouldn't be so much of the mantra, us against the world, because there are people who bypassed those particular biases. I mean, you think about Satchel Paige was able to pitch in the major leagues when he was near 60. Hoyt Wilhelm played baseball until his late 40s. George Blanda played near 50. So it's not like we haven't overcome those things. But I think that, what often makes us susceptible to it is somewhat in our own mind and our own abilities, and that we don't have to play up to the perception of what younger hiring managers or employers would think.
Yeah, I think today we have a much broader range of ages in the workplace today, actually more than we've ever had before.
Right.
And so therefore, if I'd come out of college in my early 20s and had to go work with my grandfather. Didn't happen. Today, that could happen. I probably would have gone, wow, this is strange. And so we're kind of walking in new territory. We're also seeing people work a lot longer. I mean, I'm working with one 67-year-old gentleman who's remaking himself into a big data guy.
Yeah.
And he's probably going to work into his mid-70s, if not later. And that was unheard of 20 years ago.
Sure.
So you wrote a blog post for the Career Pivot blog called The 8 Ways Older Workers Invite Age-Conscious Bias on Social Media. Can you talk to the audience about those 8 ways?
Yes. And
by the way, I thought they were quite relevant.
Yeah, well, the biggest thing is you and I have seen for years different comments people make on Facebook, and we've coached them to be more about your brand awareness and not about your physical and social quirks or even your job search or workplace quirks. Complaining about them just sets a very bad precedence for you and an employer that may be voyeuring your particular profile. But generally, what I think that older people tend to do is that we tend to take for granted that, I'm being, just want to be transparent. I will say anything that's on my mind. And we take proud of it. And sometimes we give the appearance that, even if it means somebody gets a little insulted, we don't mind. Well, along with that pride comes the fall, if you will. When somebody looks at hiring you, whether it's for an employer or for a contract or to even refer you, which we don't think about. And really, your referrals can come from anywhere. Even if it's somebody who doesn't have a job, they may have a parent that does what you want to do. And if they like you, they'll refer you. If they don't like you, they may not unfollow you, but they may not be as helpful. But you want to present yourself in a way that attracts yourself to an employer. So when you're too proud to let accomplishments go and you're sharing stuff that ages you, or that you're sharing your medical aches, pains, and illnesses, and you're sharing, instead of sharing the pictures from your phone camera, you're sharing old Polaroids that you got your sons or your daughters to scan for you, and it looks like a Polaroid. That says more than what you think it does. It tells an employer that you're old and that you're not willing to adjust to technology. I mean, there's smarter ways to present yourself, and there's a lot of other ways. But energy is something that we talked about. Talking about the things the way they used to be a lot says a whole lot about you. And, you don't even have to vocalize that you're still kicking and screaming to use technology. I mean, but, there are people who've said it. But, there's a lot of things that may not say that, you may not have told your age, and you may not have said that I graduated from college in 1980. But, there are other things that could say that you're old, and that may give somebody pause and saying, I need to find somebody who's more relevant for that position that I'm interested in.
We reach a point where we don't understand how the way we write, how we talk dates us. And as you say, depending on what you share on social media, one of the things that people tend to forget is when you write something on social media, it's there forever. In fact, I reviewed a book called The Reputation Economy. And one of the things the author talked about was it is now more expensive to delete data than it is to add more storage. So if you say something on social media, and this is particularly around politics, and I don't say anything related about politics on any of my social media. And the other piece is we have reached a point, I get comments on my blog from really very angry people. And writing really angry comments in places is not a good thing.
Yes. And speaking of which, when I wrote that post, you and I haven't discussed this, but I heard from one of your readers And he wasn't angry, but it sounded like he was on the brink, because he talked about, well, you said our resume should not have all this information. I said I had to kind of, well, let's do a reset here. This is about social media, not about your resume. And he said, well, yes, I understand that. But what he was trying to get at, it looks like he was trying to justify in his mind that bias was going to be implemented against him no matter what he did, is what I gathered from that. And I know he may even listen to this and may correct me. But I think, though, the bigger picture is when you do write something like that to someone, even in an email, that they're going to take away something that you don't want them to. Not particularly of what you said, but because of the tone. And that's probably, we could make that even number 9, is that if your tone is curmudgeon-like, or if it does not have a solution-oriented tone to it, that people are going to take it to that you're disgruntled and that you wouldn't be able to function in a team. And that could be detrimental to you invited that particular bias on yourself.
You bring up an interesting point, because I have had various clients in the last couple of years who will receive an email from their boss and say, "Oh, he's angry at me." Mm-hmm. And I'm going, "And how do you know that?" And they'll go, "Well, he's so terse." And I said, "He's probably stressed. Why don't you go talk to him?" Mm-hmm. But exactly. A lot of times when we write, emotions are very difficult to be correctly interpreted through the written word.
Yes.
Unless you're good, and I'm not good.
Yes.
So I have to be very careful about the words I select and how I write. When we're ticked off, it tends to come out. Or when we're stressed, when we are stressed, that stress will come through because we'll write in shorter sentences, we'll be more direct. We won't be as nuanced in the words we use, and people will pick up on that. And yes, there will be bias. It's interesting where I really noticed my quote unconscious bias in a unrelated. Back in 2004, 2006, I went off and taught high school in an inner city high school. Mm-hmm. I taught high school math, and I remember near the end when I was really stressed. I remember sitting out in the courtyard, and my population I dealt with was about 90% Hispanic. And I remember sitting there watching all the kids get off the bus, and they're all, the guys all got their jeans halfway down their ass. And I'm just going, wow, I don't fit here. And I really had to work through, particularly my first 6 months of not making up stories about these kids. Because I would commonly tell people that, probably 90% of my kids had probation officers. And I said, but they're not bad kids.
Right.
But it's easy to infer that they were, and that's where your brain tends to go. Mm-hmm. So and this is the same thing as we start dealing with people of other ages. It's rather interesting. I run into this exactly the same thing with folks our age dealing with millennials. Mm-hmm. Making assumptions about how they are, and in some ways they're just as discriminated against by us.
Well, I spent 4.5 years as a substitute teacher, even in my 40s. No, that was kind of the bridge between 40s and my 50s, just because I was still figuring out the whole entrepreneur thing, and I needed some income to supplement, and on my journey, I still do. but having said that, the teachers that I looked to for help, I enjoyed the younger teachers. And they were helpful. But the wisdom came from the older ones, and that maybe because I was older, but because I guess to some degree in my learning, and I was also doing my master's in that time in education, that culturally, I think unconscious bias looks a little bit different in different cultures. In a lot of the Asian related cultures, they look at older people as being wise, and they're esteemed, and they still hold fairly high offices, at least up until recently. And they look to them as wise, and the family holds them, the matriarch and patriarch, in almost a religious high statute fashion. And so, Americans, we tend to look at the older workers and people in our family as kind of, okay, we're glad that you're here, but you're passing the torch, or we'll take the torch from you. Not saying whether it's right or wrong, but I think one thing that older workers can do to leverage is to build those relationships in such a way that you can be looked in that way. And you could be looked at that way if you gain and you try to earn the respect, which means you may have to go to the dark side of technology and just learn how to put a USB port in your computer so that it will power your iPhone or something to that sort. I mean, it's not the end of the world, even as we talk about it. People are going to have those biases, but you can diffuse the bomb before it goes off by building those relationships. And that's where, as we talk about networking, we join these different organizations that were helpful, that we could be seen in a way that's positively helpful to our own careers and our own entrepreneur ventures.
It's interesting. At my first startup, I was very dependent on my young field engineers. So I purposely went out of the way to make myself look like them. Mm-hmm. So, for example, for 2 years, I came in shorts and T-shirts every day. And most of these young field engineers stopped forgetting I was a manager. Mm-hmm. And they would just consider me just like one of them. And, of course, they would tell me stuff that, their boss was a peer of mine, and they'd be wondering, mm-hmm. I'd be wondering, why are you telling me this stuff?
Right, but that was good, right?
Oh, yeah. No, they would confide in me, but also they'd come around me every tax season, and I can't tell you the number of times I discussed with them, no, you're not borrowing from your 401k. No, you're not borrowing from your 401k. When they would have these discussions, and again, young guys doing really stupid stuff, and I would walk around going, I used to do that when I was young and stupid. And that kind of irreverence, because they knew I was joking around, and because when we were acquired, there were about 100 of us who were on board, and there were 4 of us who were over 40. The 4 of us who were over 40, and I was upper in my mid to late 40s at the time. We looked different. Right. But I purposely worked those relationships so that they wouldn't see me as this old guy, that they would open up to me. And I really, really worked those relationships.
Sure. And I think that's the key in both ways, is to learn that no bridge is any good if it's burnt down. And once you burn it down, it's unlikely that you'll be able to build it back. You can, but it's so much harder. And it makes you look like you're trying hard. And often, for people to see you sweat isn't particularly always a good thing.
Yes. So, Mark, I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
The only thing I would say is, the whole idea, and I think the theme of the talk that you listen to, and as I talk to people throughout, whether they agree unconscious bias exists or not, because there are people out there who don't think it exists or that it matters, is that at the beginning of it, you got to think, how can I have an amicable and respectful conversation with this person about their bias or about my bias? Because I think if you have a bias and you realize it, I think you should go talk to the person or persons. I think it also should be a proactive thing that works even better if you really want to build a relationship with especially young people, and just be able to have the conversation. We're not talking about getting rid of unconscious bias, because it's always going to be there. I'm not fooled for a hot second that we just overcome our biases overnight. But once we make them aware, or make ourselves aware of our own biases, we've taken the first step. The second step is to see that it hurts people. And you may think that, it's your right to say something, but is it your right to continue to make people feel the way you do with your bias? And shouldn't hurting someone is enough for you? If somebody stepped on your toes, I have a right to step on your toes. Yeah, but you keep hurting me is the issue. And if you think about all those terms, I think you will become much more approachable, much more friendlier, and perhaps even more hireable if it applies to you on one way or another.
Well, Marc, this has been a great talk.
Yes.
If someone wants to get a hold of you to discuss this or any other topic, how can they find you?
They can find me at thevoiceofjobseekers.com, of course, the blog and the podcast, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. You can find me there on all those channels, usually either by Marc A. Dyson or Marc Anthony Dyson.
You mean you're on Instagram? I'm
on Instagram, dude, with the young folks.
Somehow I'm not a big picture taker, and I don't like I'm just not a Instagram kind of guy, at least not yet. It took me a long time to figure out Twitter. So
yeah,
we'll see.
It took me a while to figure out Instagram. But once I'm on there, I'm glad I met some really great people there.
Well, thank you for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast, Marc. I know we'll talk again.
Oh, yeah. Dude, can't go without it.